Welcome back to From the Burbs to the Tetons. This is part 2 in a series of videos where we're talking about buying property with an emphasis on buying land. Today we're going to talk about doing your due diligence on being prepared and ready to make that offer. The last thing you want to do is make an offer on some land and buy some land and then not be able to build your dream house. So the first topic we're going to talk about is financing your purchase. One of the obvious options is just paying cash for it. Not everybody can do that. Even though I had the money to pay cash for my land, that would have taken a lot of my cash flow away from that I need to do the build. So I wanted to finance my property, so I would have that cash left over for the build. So I had a few options. One option is owner financing. Now, not all owners are going to be willing to finance it. It can get kind of ugly for them. They're on the hook for the loan. Not all of them want to take on that responsibility of being a bank. But it's great if you can get them to do it. Now, the other thing is, too, is if they're willing to do that, I would also, as a buyer, want everything done kind of in legal ease. I'd want a loan document, kind of certified by a lawyer. I want a title company involved at the closing to go ahead and make sure that the title got transferred to my name and that it was free and clear and legal, and possibly title insurance if need be. So that's one way to consider on how to finance your property. Another way might be with a building loan. So when you do a building loan, part of the building loan is financing the purchase of materials, and then the land just becomes a piece of material. One of the drawbacks of that is it's only a 12-month loan, maybe 18 months sometimes, depending on the bank. That means that you've got to build your house pretty quickly. Usually when you do that, you're looking at like a kit house or a spec house or something that's been prefabbed. The third way would be to get a loan from a bank. Now, this isn't a traditional mortgage. Not all banks offer land loans, and not all banks give loans, mortgage type loans in all states. They have to be registered in that state to do business. So it's not just walk into your neighborhood bank and say, hey, I want a land loan and this is what I'm buying, and they'll actually do that. And there's caps on these loans. The lowest cap I saw was $50,000 from a credit union, and then the highest cap I saw with a couple of the banks was $250,000. Even though the banks structure the loans like a mortgage, it's not your typical mortgage. So I have a 5-year ARM, year 4 and year 5, the interest rate goes up fairly dramatically. And they do that kind of as an incentive to roll the loan over into a real mortgage. That is, you know, build your home, get a real mortgage for both the house and the land. So let's move on to the second most important area I think you have to consider, and that's, what are you actually buying? And I'm sure most of you are going, oh yeah, I'm buying the 6 acres. Well, it's not that simple. So you have easements, you have other rights that you need to think about that don't always go part and parcel with you purchasing the land. And most of these will come up when the title company does a title search. Sometimes the property owner will know some of this stuff, but not all the time. And they may not include it on purpose just because they don't want to scare anybody. So to give you an example, let's go over my easement and property rights and things. So first is there's a easement for 40 feet of land on the south side of my property. Now, the easement is for farm equipment and moving cattle. There are no farms anymore in that area. Well, there is one piece of land right in front of me that is being farmed for hay, but it's not a farm. There's no farmhouse, there's no animals. They would not need to use the easement. They have a way onto their own property there where they're doing their hay gathering. So that one isn't a real concern to me. Plus, the statute in the county is that I have to have 30 feet of easement on that side of the property. It's 30 feet on the right, left, and front, and 40 on the back. The next one is mineral rights, and the person who has those mineral rights only has half of them, and it's joint, meaning that we own the mineral rights together. So one person can't make a decision about the mineral rights without the agreement of the other one. I also went ahead and looked up who these two people were that had these rights to see if I couldn't buy them from them. My understanding is that owners back in the day, probably 40, 50, 60 years ago, when Wyoming, and I believe Montana too, started finding a lot of coal and some oil and natural gases, the thought was, well, I don't want to sell my property for, you know, pennies on the dollar basically as farmland and then have somebody, you know, hit this big oil strike and me miss out. So I tried to find them to see if I couldn't buy them back, and both of these rights were a person's first name and last name, and that's it. No other information. So I think somebody would be hard-pressed, you know, 2 or 3 generations older, you know, removed from the person who originally had these rights, to prove that they still had the rights. They're minimal. Again, the mineral one, because it's joint, they can't just come onto my property and start digging or drilling or whatever. I would have to agree to that beforehand. And unfortunately, well, I guess it's not that big of a deal because they know there's not any minerals in the valley. There's no oil in the valley, and or coal, and so I wouldn't want to dig anyways, but I wouldn't be able to dig either without their approval, because we own that right jointly. Another one is the Grand Teton Canal Company that manages all of the water runoff from the snowmelt in the valley. They have a canal on my west side of my property, right where I drive onto the property where the driveway is. So I had to work with them to get permission to put in a culvert, and their easement is given to them by the state, and the way it reads is, you know, go ahead and get permission from them so they can approve the design. But the bottom line on their easement is really that I can't materially obstruct their use of the property for the purpose that they have it for, which is a 4-foot by 2-foot canal. It's 4 feet wide, about 2 feet deep, to have water runoff and control that and get it out to the river. Or they're able to also, you know, with all the different canals in the valley, move it from one farm to another farm if need be. Water rights. As far as I can tell, I don't have water rights, but the water rights in Idaho seem to be black magic to figure out whether you have them or you don't. Part of that reason is because a lot of the water rights were put together in one huge water right block, and then you have certificates of right to use out of that huge block. And then there's other things that are kind of like not as normal. Let's say they've got leases in place for certain things, like a windmill, a telephone tower, forestry, and then sometimes they're just bizarre things. So this housing development, basically the person who originally owned the land put in a rider into the homeowners association rules, the CCRs, that any land that wasn't part of the build envelope would be farmland available for him to farm. At least that's the way I understand it from my real estate agent. Let's say you buy a 10-acre lot there and you get the homeowners association to approve your architectural design, where you're going to put it on the property. And then once you do that, all the rest of the property belongs to this other guy to farm, more or less. You don't get to use it the way you want to. It's got to be dedicated to this farmland. And the interesting thing is that the homeowners association doesn't get any of that money, and neither do you. The farmer keeps all the money from using the farmland. About the only benefit you do get is you get a tax break on there being farmland. So the way the county works is if you've got 10 acres and 2 acres is being used for your house, then it gets billed at the normal tax rate. But if the other 8 acres is being used for farm, then it gets taxed as farmland, which is a lot cheaper. So some things to consider that will affect your ability to build on the property. The compression of the soil. You want it to be at a reasonable level so you can put normal footers in. Otherwise, you might have to put very deep posts in the ground to support building. There are certain kinds of clay. It's referred to marine clay or quick clay. So let me get back to talking about soils. I've got some help here now. So let's talk about marine clay and quick clay. It's mostly on the coasts, but it can be very dangerous for you to build on this stuff. It tends to really absorb water easily. It's like a sponge. It will actually expand. It also will create layers so that you can have hydroplaning between layers of clay. If you get that hydroplaning going on and you've got your house built on one of these levels, it could slide. I have a friend where their house out in Oregon slid about 6 inches. Luckily, the whole house slid. They had to have engineers come in, make sure it was still sound and that kind of stuff. I think they had to shore up a few places in the house. And so that's another consideration. So the quality of the soil where you want to build is important. I've also heard where people want to go ahead and put in a basement and they start digging and then there's a boulder the size of a dump truck. That's pretty expensive to go ahead and then dynamite it out so that you can still put your basement where you want to. Well, Hal just had to make a guest appearance. So now that he's gotten his attention, I'll get back to things that you want to consider during your due diligence. So we're talking about the clay issue, also the quality of the soil as far as building on it. Both, very important things to consider and can affect the cost of your build wildly. Then there's kind of I think a quality of living area that you want to examine, which would be, airports nearby, trains nearby, how close is the highway, how busy is the highway, is there a school nearby, football games on Friday night until, 11:30 might not be your thing. How is the property around you zoned? Is some of it commercial but just not developed yet? So you go in, build your dream house, and then right next door, 7 years later, a factory gets put up. Seasonal issues. So, just because you looked at the property and it looks great and everything's cool in late July, August, that doesn't mean in the spring there isn't a ton of water runoff and it's swampy. You have a little stream that turns into a river during the springtime. What's the issue with weeds on the property? Possibly there's a lot of weed abatement laws in the West. Let's say during the fall there's a migration of birds and your town just happens to be one of their favorite layover places every year. That could be awfully nasty for a week or two with a million birds flying around and pooping every place, including on you. So you can't just look at the property for that one little window and say, ooh, I love it. Ask about the effects of the changing seasons on the way the property ends up changing. So let's go ahead and talk utilities. That's going to be electrical, water, sewer, telephone, if you're still doing copper telephone, fiber, or internet, whichever one you want to call it. So the first one that most people look at is electricity. Do you have an electrical line anywhere near your property? Then you've got to decide, okay, it's near my property. How much is it going to cost me to go ahead and run it from where, a pole is right now or underground is right now to where to my property and then onto my property. You know, I've seen stories where it's like, oh, there's a pole 10 miles away and it would cost, you know, $60,000 just to get it strung to my property, then an additional amount of money to put it on my property. At that point, you may want to consider doing off-grid. One of the big things with off-grid is the size of your battery. $60,000 allows you to buy a lot of batteries. So that's one of the things you've got to consider putting a budget together on what it's going to cost. I was lucky, there's a telephone pole right on my property, so I can just pull the electrical from there. Water and sewer. Are you going to be able to hook up to a county or city water system? If you're doing rural like I am, I would say probably it's about an 80-20 split that you're going to be able to hook up, with 80% not being able to hook up to city and 20% of the time being able to. I'm going to have to do my own system, so I'm going to have to drill a well, and I'm going to have to put in a septic system. So I'm going to have to do a well. You should have some knowledge about how far down the aquifer is to drill based on other wells that have been drilled in the area. Luckily in Idaho, it's a law, and well, the state basically keeps track of every well drilled in the entire state. So you can go online and just look what how far down your neighbors went. My closest well was 140 feet. There was another well that was pretty close. It's 160 feet. They don't tell how much extra they drilled. So talking to the state guy, he highly recommended doing an extra 10 feet. Talking to the drilling guy, he said he feels like I should do an extra 20 feet, because there have been some dry seasons where the aquifer level dropped 10 to 15 feet. So he was feeling much more comfortable doing 20 feet. I'll probably just have him do 25 feet to make sure. It's a lot less expensive than drilling a whole new well and having him just do an extra 25 feet to make sure I'm in good water. Septic at this point. So you should definitely get a percolation test. You're also going to probably have to get a soil test as far as compaction goes before you start building, so they know what kind of footing to put in for your building. Depending on your percolation test results, you're going to have to make a decision on what kind of septic system to put in. I know of 4 systems that are available. One of them is your standard tank, and then there's a leach field. That's pretty straightforward, simple, inexpensive. I have really great percolation, and that's not going to be a problem for me. But let's say it was a problem. Then they have another form where they often will dig up maybe a foot or 2 of soil, and then they'll pile up a 5-6 feet of soil. So basically it's an above ground leach field, and that allows you to get a reasonable amount of percolation by putting in the proper soil that percolates, 5 or 6 feet, and the rest of it's good enough to do the rest. Let's say you don't have that. Let's say that's not an option. Primarily it might be because you've got swampy land or something like that. Then what you might have to do is put in a filtration system, and they're really expensive. So what it would be is you'd get a septic tank with multiple chambers. Some of the first chamber would be kind of like the normal septic tank, but then the additional chambers would be filters for filtering out a lot more stuff before it lets it out into your yard or into the water system. That can be pretty expensive. Now, it may be to a point that won't even work, and you would have to do something like what RVs have. They have a black tank, and it just fills up, and then you got to get it emptied. So you might have to put in a 5 or 10,000 gallon tank, and then have somebody come out every 3 to 6 months and empty it for you. So for me, the most important thing is going in with your eyes open. We've talked about this. Very few of us can just write a blank check and go, oh, yep, just build it. We need to be able to go in with our eyes open, have some kind of a budget. If all of these things that we're talking about were to hit you at one time, it could make a $100,000 difference in the price of building, which could blow your budget. So it's important to know how you're going to deal with all these things. And then the last one, internet/telephone. Now, I'm lucky enough that in Teton Valley, they've been making a concerted effort to put in fiber throughout the entire valley, and I have fiber next to my property, so I'll be able to put in fiber. And, you know, that's another thing for you to consider. Are you even going to have a home phone? Is it just going to be your cell phones, which a lot of millennials are doing these days. They don't bother to get a home phone. So that, you know, those are the things to consider there. So let's talk construction and permits. So some of the permits are going to be county level permits, and some might be state level permits. So in Idaho, a state level permit would be electrical, plumbing, sewer, and well drilling. All of those require a state level permit. The actual stick frame building itself is a county level permit in Idaho. It's going to be different from state to state. Some of the counties in Idaho don't require you to actually get a build permit. I am in a county that does require a build permit, and I'd want to get a build permit anyway. Some people are kind of like, hey, I don't want them telling me what to do. At least the way I look at this is that the permitting system is to make sure that I construct the building to a minimum level of quality. And I plan on going way over the quality that they want, but it's nice to know if I miss something. Let's say I'm good with electrical, but I don't do it for a living, so what if I miss something? I'd like somebody who's an expert to come behind me and just go, oh, you missed these 3 things out of the 90 things you did in the house electrical-wise, fix them. And that's going to make it safer for my family. I want to make sure that I've designed the house to the snow loads that are required by the county so that my house doesn't fall down. Another one that I had not even thought about when I was going into this that my real estate agent pointed out was the fire department. The fire department is going to have their say on building permits and occupancy permits. So it's important to check out what's needed there. Because the last thing you want to do is build your house and not be able to move into it because the fire department says, hey, you know what? We can't put out a fire here. You can't live in it. I've pretty much covered everything that I was hoping to in the video. Just some closing things. One, I covered a lot of stuff, but by no means is that a complete list. People are running into new things every single year that is just completely unexpected and off the wall. If you've got something that you've run into, or if you're working with a real estate agent and they recommended you, do some due diligence in an area I didn't cover, please comment down below. Let's educate each other on this stuff. So another place of great information are local and state government departments. I got so much help and encouragement from the building permit guy, electrical, plumbing, septic, water. They just were really happy to help out. I think the way they look at it is, it's a lot easier to tell me no before I've spent any money than to come on site to do a final inspection and say, oh yeah, you did this and you just wasted $10,000 in a month. That's not a fun conversation to have for either side. So reach out to them and really use them and lean on them for their information. They're happy and glad to do it. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please give it a thumbs up. Hit the subscribe button, and if you want to know when we're going to be putting up a new video, go ahead and hit that bell button.